So, welcome back. I hope you have been nourished by that wonderful spread of mostly healthy. Healthy or not depends on how much we take in at the end of the day, I suppose. As long as we're not putting a spread of poison. And healthy or not depends on self-control. Lack of, then suffering. I thought I'll share something with you. Something that I wrote in 2013 and posted somewhere and forgot about it until a friend kind of randomly found it and say, hey, remember this? Say, oh, right. The truth is I don't know how much it has to do directly with the topic here, but it's kind of a good, I would say, foundational kind of reflection. And so I will read what was posted there. Yeah, reached that point where I have to take this out. It was very recently when this happened. So kind of fresh and raw of this. So the title of this short article is "It Can't Be Fixed." It can't be fixed. We often do not think much about spirituality or pay any attention to our interior lives, our heartscapes, until something that we really cherish breaks. Maybe our health or our heart breaks, or both. Or a partner's heart or health breaks, or our partnership breaks, or perhaps our life plans, or trust is broken. And when breakage happens, we immediately want it fixed. We search high and low for a super glue that can glue back together all the shattered pieces. So we gather up all the bits and pieces of our lives. We carefully keep the shards and chips as we believe that we will finally find that super glue that can make our lives all good, whole, and intact again. Never again to break. Forever. Good as new. In many ways, this is perfectly understandable. Who doesn't want it, whatever it might be, to be fixed when it's broken? So we try to fix it with meditation, or we try to fix it with chanting, perhaps a new diet, or a hot yoga class can fix it. If healthy and holistic can't fix it, maybe we turn to partying or philandering. We could pick up dancing, maybe square, maybe line, possibly hippie contra, or even exotic belly. Or we sign up for 12 steps, or the 5 Tibetans yoga. We might even consider exorcism, or the laying of hands. Meanwhile, some turn to mail ordering Viagra from Canada for their husbands, or themselves. And while some put on their old Sunday best that they have left lonely in the closet for years and turn to God and Jesus to fix it, others give cross-dressing and leg waxing a desperate try. Or maybe becoming a born-again brown rice Birkenstock Buddhist for a 6-month trial period might do the trick. Surely the posture, prostrations, and pujas will be the fix. But in the end, if we are lucky, or if we have enough good karma ripening, we hear for the first time the Buddha's answer to all these breakages. The lion's roar declaring, it can't be fixed. You cannot fix change. Impermanence cannot be improved. Next year's model is last year's model, no matter how you spin it or sell it. So maybe this is bad news. Poor Humpty Dumpty. If that depresses you too much, then I guess you could consider the other shoe to this answer. And the other side to this story is, it can't be fixed because it ain't broken. So there's some good news for you if you need some cheering up. Beyond this, the Buddha doesn't promise us anything. Yes, there is suffering, anguish, and pain when things break. No denying that. But whereas there's nothing you and I, or for that matter anyone, could do about the unstable nature of things, or the impermanence of anything or situation, the suffering or anguish we experience and sometimes get overwhelmed and consumed by when things break, when they fall apart, is a variable option. An add-on that can be dropped, cut, no termination fee, no penalty. When we see the truth of it can't be fixed, we have taken the first step to growing up. We have embarked on awakening to basic sanity. We are on our way to freedom from confusion. We begin to see how we can unclench and release our fixations. Our fixation on trying to change. When we give up manufacturing certainty and issuing lifetime warranties for inherently unstable things, we no longer live under the tyranny of the belief that everything can be fixed. We liberate ourselves from a mania of fixing that which is not broken. There is no turtle hair to harvest, no flowers to collect in space, just release and rest. With fixations released, the mind is released into ease. Here I'm reminded of Kyopa Jigten Sungkyun's words on fixation, especially fixation on self. Fixation on self as, quote, the ability of the son of a barren woman to climb the ladder of the horns of a rabbit, to swallow the sun and moon of the sky, and cause the six realms to fall into an ocean of darkness. Again, fixating on self as, quote, the ability of the son of a barren woman to climb the ladder of the horns of a rabbit, to swallow the sun and moon of the sky, and cause the six realms to fall into an ocean of darkness. In this darkness, we respond to change and impermanence as breakages to be fixed, anomalies and aberrations to be corrected or abhorred. Starting with this confusion, we begin to think of ourselves as the talented sons and daughters of our barren mother, on some sort of heroic quest or journey to find non-existent rabbit horns to climb in order to reach the sun and moon, the happily ever after till death do us part world that we fantasize about. In this darkness, we insist and demand that the nature of phenomena be something else. And so, despite the obvious, we continue to wander in search for a fix instead of relinquishing the fixation. That's it.
Yay.
So it can't be fixed.
Because it's not broken.
It's not broken. It's just the way it is. It is inconstant. It is not self. When self is involved, it is painful. is dukkha. These are the three characteristics. So we talk about love, basic goodness, all good, universal good, pink and light. That's important. But also to see it's inconstant, it is not self. Whenever self is involved, and self will be involved until that state. Until then, it will entail dukkha, pain, suffering. Just knowing that, even intellectually, not superficially, but intellectually knowing that, can, bring so much more lightness to whatever situation we find ourselves in. And bring ourselves stability as well. Some kind of stability. Not be thrown off completely. So I think everybody has this handout that we have been working with. So let us once again go over, read together the 16 lines, these 4 verses of the opening verses of Candakirti's entering of the middle way. Shravakas and intermediate Buddhas are born from the mighty sages, and the fully awakened Buddhas are born from the Bodhisattvas. A compassionate mind, understanding of non-duality, and bodhicitta, these are the causes of the victor's heirs. Love is the seed of this abundant harvest of Buddhahood. It is like the water which causes growth and expansion, and it ripens into the state of lasting enjoyment. Therefore, at the outset, I shall praise compassion. Firstly, with the thought of I, they cling to self, and then with mind, they grow attached to things. Helplessly, they wander like a turning water wheel. To compassion for these beings I bow down. Beings like the moon in rippling water, fitful, fleeting, empty in their nature. Bodhisattvas see them thus and yearn to set them free. Their minds come under the power of compassion. So yesterday, we mostly have covered the first 2 verses, the first 8 lines. And so if you were not here, then perhaps if you have a Facebook account, go to the EBS public Facebook page. Those videos, live cast from yesterday are posted there. For those of you out there watching that might not have been with us yesterday, you can go to the Ecumenical Buddhist Society of Little Rock. You're either on that one or you're on the Urban Dharma North Carolina Facebook page. If you're watching now, you're either watching from one or the other. Then you can go to those pages and look for the videos from yesterday where we covered the first 8 lines. But just as a quick summary, so that we have some context to looking at the next 8 lines, there basically, this author, Candakirti, says that there are 3 things that need to come together, 3 aspects of training the mind that needs to come together in order to turn an ordinary person into the state of a bodhisattva. And what are bodhisattvas? Bodhisattvas are those who eventually become Buddhas. So, and these 3 factors, or these 3 mind trainings that have to come together, the first one, he says, is a compassionate mind. The second one is an understanding of non-duality, and the third is bodhicitta, So here, compassionate mind, he seems to include, from the second verse we learned that, here he seems to include loving kindness as part of compassionate mind. And so yesterday and this morning, we learned some techniques that could help us cultivate loving kindness. As yesterday somebody pointed out, another word for meditation, or the work of meditating, is this word called bhavana in Pali. And bhavana, if you translate that into English, is to cultivate. So when you cultivate something, one of the most important qualities of a good cultivator is patience. So if you take up gardening, if you're an impatient type, if you take up gardening and don't give up immediately, it will train your patience and your appreciation for patience and care. And so the work of bhavana, the work of meditation, is a work of care and patience as well. And so that those are essential for cultivating these states of mind. So loving kindness and compassion. So there then we gave definitions, because these words are used by many people with slightly different meanings. We're not saying that only the Buddhist definition is the only correct definition, but we want to see, what is being addressed here. Right? So here, what we call love here, the Indian word is metta or maitri. Metta or maitri, yes, certainly can be translated as love, but it has more a connotation. So what kind of love? It has more a connotation of the kind of love that we see in the quality of friendliness, of the wish of goodwill and well-being, to whether self or to other. It's that kind of love. It's not the passionate love between individuals. It's not even the, say, Sufi kind of love of God, which is, again, this passionate, like you're kind of elevated to a higher state of being where the self dissolves, and so it's not that ecstatic love either. Again, time and place for that, I know. Here, this quality is that of this genuine wish for someone's wellness, for their happiness, a feeling of friendliness, a feeling of extending goodwill. That's what this metta is. Compassion, or karuna there, is referring to a wish for the freedom or absence of suffering. So in a way, it's the other side of the same coin. Looked at it from another perspective, right? When we wish someone happiness, essentially we're wishing that they're free from suffering. But then again, there is usefulness in looking at both sides carefully. So in looking at both sides carefully, yesterday we discussed how, in general, it's not so advisable to start by looking at the suffering side, because we so easily get caught up in suffering. Unfortunately, for many of us, it seems like suffering is more dangerously infectious than happiness. Right? That's our current, I think, for most of us. We are much more susceptible to suffering than happiness. So, as a strategy, so then Buddha says, start first by focusing on the happiness side. Leave the suffering side for later. But after we have been suffused by the loving kindness, this happiness side, after we have this shield, this protection, or sometimes this invisibility cloak, so that suffering can't find you, then you can go looking for suffering, but not be infected by suffering. That's when we turn our attention to compassion. So compassion is the wish for an end to suffering. and also an end to those causes of suffering. So those two are part of that first element, a compassionate mind. Understanding of non-duality, to refresh our memory of what we talked about yesterday, I say, again, this term is a loaded term, non-duality. Non-duality. Usually it's capitalized, non-duality. And then it becomes like kind of big, metaphysical, mystical. You know, we are all one, you know, everything dissolves, the universal ground of everything, the universal consciousness, which we're all part of. I think it's accurate to say that the historical Buddha himself didn't use a lot of expressions like that in his teachings. Much later, others in the Buddhist tradition did start using such language, and I think it's useful too. But for me personally, I always feel like if we have to choose, we go back to our first reference point, Sid. We go back to our first reference point. And for me, I'm kind of the boring type. Yes, in our tradition, we have the great Mahasiddhas, you know, the crazy wisdom types. That's like just, they're icing. This is cake. This is staple. That's a treat from time to time. For me, not capable of handling this more bombastic, maybe swifter. This should be, I feel, our reference point. Especially these days, some of you may know certain problems with certain teachers. The problems have been publicized. And it's causing a lot of pain and turmoil in the lives of people who are directly or indirectly involved. Some of the conversations that have been generated, you know, some people in turmoil, you know, very understandable, try to look to the direction of the lives of these Mahasiddhas with crazy wisdom and try to make some sense out of, you know, all that is going on. I understand that, but I also want to say, if we're going to look back, I think we should look back to the root. And nowhere in any of the accounts of the life of the root teacher is there is any ambiguity about matters of, you know, harm and help. Buddha Shakyamuni was so careful. He didn't even behave in a way of like, we should not care what other people think. Some of the Mahasiddhas behave like that. Oh yes, no doubt. And I don't question their level. And I don't question the necessity of them behaving like that given their circumstance. I don't. Because after all, I come from the tradition that accepts the Mahasiddhas. But now, the root, we go back to the root. A lot of the rules, for example, that monks and nuns end up having today, according to the Vinaya, how it tells it, is frequently people come and complain to the Buddha. Oh, your monks are doing da-da-da-da-da-da. And then the Buddha said, okay, I'll deal with it. Thank you for telling me. Then he calls them and he says, you know, we should not do this. And they're not even ethical things, what we consider to be ethical infringements. Of course, that out. But it's things like some monk, some story was peeing, standing up, and some sort of like problem that offended someone. So actually, I don't know if you know, but actually according to the strict Vinaya rules, monks cannot stand when they're peeing. Yeah. Well, clearly there's no ethical issue there, but even that, the Buddha took care, so he did not say, don't worry about what other people think of you. He said, no, your action has offended. So it's good for your training not to do it. So from now on, in my community, those who wear my robes, you can't pee standing up. Now, of course, that rule is not taken literally today, but it's there. But just an example of the care that Buddha Shakyamuni took, so that outer and inner corresponds. So then, fast forward to Atisha giving this instruction. Remember, I think I talked about this opening night. Externally, always carry yourself with the care and deportment of the Hinayana, which means conduct yourself in a way that avoids, to whatever degree that is sensible, not ridiculous degree, avoid the censure of others. He taught that. Even Atisha now, in the age of Mahasiddhas, he says, that's best. But then if you only do that to keep up with appearances, so we're in the South, we know that. Or maybe some of you are English, you know that. If it's all just keeping up with appearances, then of course it's useless, it's hypocritical. So then he says, internally, bodhicitta. So why am I observing these rules? To avoid the censure of others? Because to be effective in connecting with others, I have to conduct myself in a way that doesn't turn people off. Now the Mahasiddhas behave the way they behave because their audience were looking for that kind of behavior. So they connected on that level. Perhaps one of the reasons. Or sometimes their job is to kind of shock you out of complacency. Yeah, of course. But again, we are always safe when we go back to the root example. That's my opinion. Of course, you can think about it. And maybe your circumstance is different. But I would say, especially when we are an organization and you have a public profile and a public face, you cannot behave Mahasiddha way. Naropa did not have he left the institution before he manifested Mahasiddha activity. He left Nalanda. Tilopa, all of that, they left. They were working on the fringes of polite society. So yeah, it will not damage kind of the image of Buddhism. Not that Buddhism needs to have a fancy image to become powerful, but public opinion, it was considered important. So if you genuinely want to work with others on a level and with the kind of skills that is going to break expectations and taboos, the example of the ancient Mahasiddhas was they left their position. They left their privilege. Naropa was one of the major deans of Nalanda University. Nalanda was the Oxford, the Cambridge of India. One of the deans. It says there are 4 towers. He was the head of one. 4 colleges, perhaps. He left. Then he manifested his Mahasiddha activities. Sometimes we get confused, because these biographies of Mahasiddhas actually, until for a long time, they were transmitted secretly. But now anyone, can click and get from Amazon.com. Then we read it so extensively and we think that this is a model for behavior. No, look, they left polite mainstream institutions in order to radically transform those who are ready to be transformed by those methods. Right? So for us, I feel, whose example should we look to? The root. You can never go wrong. The example of the root teacher, Buddha Shakyamuni. People have said, have asked, directly or indirectly to me, what's your opinion on these problems now? I said, I don't have much to say directly about the circumstances of all this because I don't know. I'm not there. I do not disbelieve, actually, the accusations because I don't know the people directly. I know enough of people involved to know, yes, these people making allegations are not lying. They're not lying. That much I know. But beyond that, I can't say about, so I don't have anything to say about like specific, we need to take a stand on this or that or that. Yeah, I don't, and also I don't feel it's my place. But I do feel that insofar as practicing Dharma, what does this all tell us? Is to tell us to return to our root teacher. Then after that, we can add whoever we want to add. But this is our root teacher, Buddha Shakyamuni. Yes, there is second Buddha. Guru Rinpoche is second Buddha. And Jidin second Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna second Buddha. And so on and so forth. Like, yeah, of course. We are in part of that lineage, so we accept them. But don't forget who is the root. If we forget the root, and then we talk about the branches, then it's kind of silly. Many of the heads of lineages now, Dalai Lama for sure, always say, look to Buddha Shakyamuni. The head of Dribung Kagyu, Dribung Kyabgun, Rinpoche, he says, Buddha Shakyamuni. So even now he has started teaching from texts from the Pali tradition. He said these are the earliest, and it's common to all Buddhist traditions. He says we emphasize too much all the differences of the different lineages until we don't. He says most of our people don't even know, haven't even read completely, even one text that we know Buddha Shakyamuni taught. He says so we need to go back to that. His Holiness the Karmapa also saying, I'm talking within the kind of Tibetan milieu of Buddhism. More and more, these heads of lineages are saying, we need to go back to our common reference point. We never go wrong. Second element, that this understanding of non-duality, right? That's where I went off on the tangent. So this non-duality here, there's so many levels of understanding non-duality. So yesterday I mentioned briefly. Basically, it's this. Whenever there's an I has turned up, and sometimes this sense of I is stronger than other times, but it's like a constant in that sense. Like it's lurking somewhere in there, but like blip, 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 blip. So it's inconstant in that sense, but in a way it's constantly always lurking there. Yeah? But the minute the self or I exists, the sense of self turns up. Or rather, it's always a sense of self. We say actually self doesn't exist, but a sense of self is constantly emerging. And the minute a sense of self emerges, then other emerges. Then in any and all interactions where self and other is in operation, then dukkha is entailed. Suffering or pain is entailed. So here he says, an understanding of non-duality. So an insight into how suffering arises is another way of saying an understanding of non-duality, without getting distracted by the big bombastic word of non-duality. It's an understanding of how suffering arises. Suffering arises due to the duality of self and other. Then the third is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta here means then the commitment, the resolve to achieve state of Buddha for the good of all. Those are the three mind trainings, the three elements that come together that turn us from ordinary, confused beings into the ranks of bodhisattvas. Then now he will expand on this one of the three, which is compassion, compassionate mind. Now, in addressing compassionate mind, in the second verse, Candakirti mysteriously uses the word love. And then love is said to be the seed of the Buddha state, the seed of freedom from confusion. Meaning, you cannot reach freedom from confusion if you don't have the seed of love, of metta. And here, metta and karuna, love and compassion. He seems to conflate the two, that two sides of that coin. So that's the seed. Then he says it's also the water that causes it to grow. And then finally, when it ripens and bear fruit, what is the fruit? Fruit is also love and compassion. So then he says, therefore at the outset, I praise compassion. Now, if we were to read it as love and compassion being differentiated, then we can also appreciate that what he's saying is start by training in love first. Yeah. Once you're in a good place, in a safe space, in a confident space, in a strong space of being nourished and supported and protected by metta, then you can look at the other side of the coin, which is the suffering side. And there is where we start compassion. So now, the next 6 lines, or you could say even 8 lines, are about compassion. First line of verse 3. Firstly, with the thought of I, we cling to self. And then with mind, we grow attached to things. Helplessly, we wander like the turning water wheel. To compassion for these beings, I bow down. So what what Candakirti is doing here is he is actually giving us 3 degrees of compassion. 3 degrees of compassion. Not really 3, yes, there is some commentary that matches 3 objects of compassion. But of course, object is always related to subject. They're interdependent. So another way of looking at it would be compassion on 3 levels of subtlety. Compassion as informed by 3 understandings, 3 insights, and progressively more accurate or profound insights. So you start with the more basic or grosser or coarser aspect of what it means to have karuna, to have compassion. So, and remembering, compassion here is defined as the wish for freedom from suffering and the causes of suffering. Yeah, that's the definition of compassion here. So what is it not a definition? What is not a definition of compassion as defined here? of karuna? No, more specifically related to, what's the English etymology of compassion?
Suffering with another.
To suffer with. Compassion. Passion is suffering. To suffer with. So in the Buddhist definition of karuna, it doesn't emphasize suffering with. And you see, that's our baggage. When we just see the English word compassion. And then again, because of how familiar and easy we kind of latch on to suffering. So when we see the word compassion, immediately we want to suffer with. Really. So yesterday, I was looking at all these news coming out of Charlottesville. I lived there for 9 years, so did Bill, for about that number of years. And for me, it's my kind of first place in the U.S. that I considered home, even though it was just graduate school, because I come from Malaysia. I don't have home in the U.S. So for me, it's like home, even after I left it since 2003. To see all of that, immediately, you suffer with. But I know that is not karuna. But I was suffering with, and that's heavy. And of course, we still get in those situations because we're human. It's better than the alternative, to rejoice in. And unfortunately, there are people who, like, yes, good, finally something is going to get better. But that was to suffer with. So you have to remember, when Buddhist sources, when Buddhist texts talk about compassion, they're not talking about suffering with. They're talking about a resolve, a wish to be done with suffering. And not just to be done with suffering, to be done with the causes of suffering. Translate to our present state, not just to be free from suffering, as in, well, I could kind of be free from suffering if I ignore the news coming out of. But I have not cut the causes of suffering. The causes of suffering, for example, in here, there are systemic problems. And there are deep, deep types of problems. Patterns of behavior, fears, that I have too, configured differently from this particular, instance of gathering of hate. But the root of that hate, we all have. Just configured differently. Yeah, of course it's there. So then when we begin to see that, that's when karuna can start to come in. Where victim and victimizer, there's a certain commonality. Now again, in kind of, I think, more public responses to things like that, you can't use that language, I feel. Yeah, you can't. Because that is not the place and the time. But at the same time, I feel in this kind of context, where we all have a base ground understanding of what the Buddha has taught, then of course we also should not spend that much time talking about, those are victims, those are victimizer, we need to protect this. Again, it's not mutually exclusive, it's context. Here we want to look deeper. And we want to recognize that everybody. So the Dalai Lama says, how do we generate compassion? Karuna. Not suffering with, but to want to end suffering for all. So then that's when, like those really difficult, those causing harm, this morning we say, radiating love and loving kindness to them, it's a lot harder. it will become a little bit easier perhaps, right? If we remember the cause of their particular way their hate comes up is related to, is finally grounded in the same reason you are here. Wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. When it comes to that, that's the great equalizer. All of us. The most heinous person who have done the most heinous thing. In a very kind of shocking way. When you first hear it, it has to be shocking. Is that it comes from seeking happiness. Now, of course, we can and we should say, how messed up is that? You know? But before we completely just kind of point fingers, in lesser degree, I hope, we have also done things that undermine our happiness as we go around looking for happiness. So it forms a link and understanding, not a co-suffering. So if there's anything that is co, right, compassion, it's not compassion. It's to form a link for us to get to a place, even if it has to go very deep, right, in order to not diminish, in non-Buddhist language, the humanity of these others. So when it comes to compassion, the challenges of compassion are also somewhat the same as the challenges of training in loving kindness, but in a different degree. It's still about partiality. So, Karen, you mentioned in the 4 immeasurables, the instructions always say, the 4th immeasurable, equanimity, has to be somewhere in there, even if you're not starting with that. But your love needs to have equanimity. But what is equanimity about? Equanimity is about insight. It's about understanding. It's about knowing that, there is an underlying commonality to all of us, which is no one, from the highest gods to the lowest hell beings in the Buddhist cosmology, or from the most powerful individual in the world, we know who he is, down to the littlest bug. Nobody wants pain. And they both seek happiness. That's the common place. That we touch, we connect to. The actions that are taken, Buddha makes very clear. Just earlier I was talking in the context of Buddhist teaching and the harm that they have caused. Same applied to this situation. It's not that Buddha says, we are all the same. And so then, there's no problem. No, there is. But before you go tackle the overt problem, you have to recognize that underlying sameness. So that when we go actually on the front lines, so to say, to tackle the problem, we don't let our emotions cloud over so that we think we're addressing the problem, then we end up harming the people that are causing harm. Instead of harming the afflictive emotions that are controlling these people. So yes, I think we can be sort of colloquially, maybe not in the Buddhist sense, be angry at such displays of hate and intimidation. We can. Yeah, we can. If, and then as practitioners, without losing sight that where the problem is so much confusion of what brings happiness, without losing sight of the desire to be happy is common to all of us. And without using that to kind of smooth over, because we have the privilege of, I'm here, I'm not there. Oh, people there, you should just have equanimity. And sometimes, Buddhist talk like turns into that. Oh, you should just have equanimity. And that's when we say, look at your privilege, whatever that is. Yeah, if you're in Asia, your yellow privilege. If you're in America, your white privilege. Your whatever privilege. Look at that. It's easy to say, so we can. Then, of course, problems with the world is very complicated. Some of us are better at handling that than others. Some of us have more know-how, wisdom, knowledge than others. So don't necessarily look to Buddhist teachers to give you solutions for those things. Now, what the Buddhist tradition has to say is back to a very deep level of where this problem is. So here, first with the thought I. So this is actually expanding on the non-duality. Right? So a sense of I, a sense of self emerges. Throughout the day, our sense of self is not constant. For the most part, it's kind of like imperceptible, under the radar, under the surface. Then something very nice happens, then it turns up quite strong. And even like maybe after metta meditation, let's face it, it was a good session. Good boy. Just turn up, stronger sense. Then it didn't go well, and a sense of self turns up again. But once, so this is showing the mechanics of suffering. The minute the feeling of I, then when you have I, you have not I, right? You have I, the minute you have self, then you have other. Then with regards to the other, according to this, you first think of mine, meaning those that you like. So it's a very kind of subtle bifurcation kind of going on. You won't say, so until you have that separation, I and not I, you can't really have mine. And once you have mine, then you have also you and yours. Me and mine, you and yours. So the thought of I causes us to cling to this self that has arisen. And the thought of mine, feeds our attachment to things. So these are the two attachments. We're attached to self or person, personal attachment, and then we're attached to phenomena, things, conditions, people. Okay, attach here. I think a better word is become possessive, become entangled. I also have been using the word entanglements for attachments. Because, again, it's such a, overused Buddhist word, right? Attachment, 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 detachment, attachment, detachment, attachment, detachment. Right? And then there's also the word attachment is used also in other fields, in the Western context. And especially in the Western psychological, attachments are not bad. And then if people think, oh, Buddhists say all attachments are bad, then they think, oh, we need to throw out these attachments. Yeah. And then you watch like Kung Fu, the legend continues. And all these monks are kind of like robots, with no emotions, but robots that kick ass, when necessary. Well, you want to find out? One of my teachers, one of my main teachers, he was a Kempo, like 20, 30 years ago. Now, we call him Kenshin Rinpoche, the great Kempo. But he was a Kempo. 20, 30 years ago, when he first arrived in the US, the center was in downtown DC. So, so one day in the neighborhood, when he first arrived, knew some rudimentary English. I mean, enough to actually, not rudimentary, enough to be translating for His Holiness, the head of the order when he came. So he was, it was downtown DC, and so apparently he was walking around, and there were some guys, hanging out, and saw him and said to him, "Hey, you." And he said, "Me?" "Yeah." It's like, "Do you know Kempo?" Kempo is a form of Japanese martial arts, like judo. And so Kempo. So my teacher said, "I am Kempo." And the guy said, okay. So Kempo didn't realize, my teacher didn't realize what was going on until later. And so members at the center kind of noticed like these individuals that are kind of milling around. Whenever Kempo came, they're like. So somehow later notes were compared and they realized what happened, my Lama said, "Well, I am Kempo." "Do you know Kempo?" It's like, "Oh, I am Kempo." Okay. So it helps, some of these projections or stereotypes. I never got that kind of stereotype. Mine is more like at the university, it's almost always like could you take a look at my computer? In the public computer labs, at UVA actually, I remember, it's so you have a whole lab full of people, right? And I'm like sitting the furthest end from where this person is. You see them walking all across, looking around, and then the consultant is not there, look around. Let's go to the Asian guy. Could you help me and take a look at... One time my roommate, it's nothing to do with this, but it's just funny. All of us in this room, maybe with the exception of Nolan, as Melissa was saying, now they don't even make computers with like a CD drive. Right? Now then go back, then there are these different disk drives of different sizes, right? So before CD drive is the ones that's about this, right? This hard hard floppy,
Yeah.
not floppy, a hard disk,
Yeah.
right, with about this big.
Yeah.
And one incarnation back is the floppy disk, right? Really floppy, this big, right?
Yeah.
So at UVA, they were just making the transition from like a floppy to this like the hard one. So my roommate was in the lab minding his own business. This was on a Friday night. Then there was a graduate student, you know, this woman that was kind of pacing around, you know, kind of came into the lab sort of in a rush, then went to the computer, paced around, went to the printer, came back, you know. And finally then went up to my roommate and said, my roommate is Asian too. Went up to the roommate and said, could you help me? I have some problem with the disk, you know, the disk drive is not reading my disk. So Rudy said, okay. So he walked down, and as he walked close to, she had folded her floppy disk into half and shoved it into. So Rudy just stood there and go, you have a copy of this file you need on your computer at home? And she said, yeah. And it's like, okay. It's like, actually. Ignorance, right? Ignorance. This is a superficial ignorance. But it's ignorance that leads to suffering, not intentions, not what we deeply want, right? But not wanting, not knowing how to get what we want. Then we destroy all the causes of happiness along the way. So when we recognize that, we can have some understanding that we don't have to be so harsh with ourselves. We don't have to be so harsh with others. We can be harsh with, you know, kind of like the habits that we have and say, you know, I need to be done with that. You know? That you can't kind of like, you know, like we're talking about like smoking, you know, as a habit. You can be harsh with that without being harsh with yourself and say, done. Just done. So the first kind of compassion is compassion that is based on seeing and recognizing that this is why we suffer. This is how beings suffer. Beings suffer because they don't see that suffering arises. This is the mechanics of suffering. So this actually it doesn't state it so obviously, but you can include to say, see, this person is not unworthy of your compassion and your metta, because it's not like he is somehow evil and irredeemable, but it's his way of trying to get to the goal of his happiness has created suffering for himself or herself and others, and is grounded in a universal condition of clinging to I and clinging to me. And now we can have some understanding, and understanding that makes a connection. That my experience need not be so foreign and different from the other person's experience. Just as I want happiness, that person wants happiness too. So here it says, once we are attached to the self and to things, once we have I and mine, then what happens? We become helpless. helpless means we lose autonomy. So it's very interesting, you know. We become bound. We become helpless. It's funny, you know, that here it says, because of clinging to self and other, or clinging to the feelings of self and other, because self and other actually don't exist, but the feeling, the imputations of self and other, because of clinging to those things, we become helpless. See, the funny thing is that we think by clinging to that, then we become not helpless. But here it says, that's how we become helpless. That's how we lose autonomy. So Buddhist autonomy is a very strange kind of autonomy, it seems. Because Buddhist autonomy is the autonomy that comes when we no longer feel the need for a bearer of experiences. That we relinquish the bearer. Then you become autonomous. You become free.
I'm not understanding the word
Relinquish.
The
The bearer.
bearer.
Earlier I talked about the bearer, the one who holds,
Yes, got it. Thank
the
you.
holder of suffering.
All right,
Then even we think Buddha is the bearer of Buddha qualities. No, actually, as long as a bearer, as long as a holder, as long as the self is there, then it's not Buddha qualities. Buddha qualities need no subject, holder, person. So we then are like a turning water wheel. Do we know what a water wheel is? Can someone describe a water wheel?
Yeah, we have one here, don't we, in North Log?
Yeah, the
middle. Yeah.
So basically, you have buckets, right?
Paddles.
But here is to actually transfer water. Yeah. So the water mill is not to transfer water, yeah?
Yeah.
Is it?
No.
No, it's
Well,
to
you
generate.
but it has water flowing into the thing, and the thing is, the wheel can't not turn because the water.
Right, but then does it transfer water?
No.
No, it powers the mill.
Oh, it powers the mill.
Energy to
Yeah, yeah. So these water wheels are for picking up water to irrigate. So it works on the same principle, of course. Yeah, it's like the power of the water kind of. So it's buckets actually. Then it's being dumped onto this pipe, and then it flows to land by a river. So that's what a water wheel does in this context. But the analogy works too, even if it's just the water mill to power something. So in Chandakirti's own commentary for this, he has an auto commentary for this. And defilements. So those buckets on the wheels are tight, and it has to be tight very strongly, otherwise, it can't do. So likewise, we are tied, we are bound so tightly by the strings of our karma and our defilements, our afflictive emotions, and the karma that it generates. Then the driving force of consciousness, of our consciousness that have bifurcated into self and other, the driving force of that is like the person that initiates. So these buckets, every morning, you don't let it run all night necessarily, because if you don't want water to be continuously taken out, so there is a handle in the morning, and somebody turns it. Then it starts, and so it says, then who is this person? It's our consciousness, our bifurcated self and other. So once that starts, then it's automatic until somebody stops it. So the third, samsara is like a deep well. from the peak of existence to the hell of unending torment, to which beings are constantly being hurled back into. Just as these goes back in, goes back in, goes back in. The fourth way, like the buckets fastened to the chain, beings fall down naturally into the lower realms. Whereas when it goes up, it's harder. Going down is easy. Lifting the water is harder. So this is how it's so easy to fall. Like in the sense of, it's so easy. Even though metta and karuna are two sides of that same coin, it's harder to get infected by metta or by the happiness that generates metta. It's so hard to be infected by the happiness that generates metta. It's so easy to be infected by the by the suffering that also is the basis of generating compassion. Happiness is the basis of generating metta. Happiness itself is not metta, but happiness is the basis of generating metta. Suffering is the basis of generating compassion. So we cannot fear suffering. We have to be careful with suffering. But we cannot fear suffering if we are going to cultivate compassion, karuna. But then, it's more infectious. Then instead of generating karuna, you suffer with the ordinary definition of compassion. Then it's downhill. Then you drown in that pain and suffering. So here.
Can you say that again? You said happiness is the basis of generating metta.
Yes.
And then
Suffering. No, suffering is the basis of generating karuna.
Ah,
Yeah. Right? On the basis of recognizing suffering,
yeah.
then we say, you need to end this. Suffering is there, you know. Just like happiness is there. It's about recognizing. So for those of us who kind of have been so kind of harmed by suffering, we might have become cold and hardened. So then we have no ability to generate compassion. And that can be, you know, that can happen. Sometimes that happens in the guise of being Buddhist as well. Although generally I meet more that are caught up in the emotion of suffering because of compassion rather than wisdom, and then become cold. So Buddhist text talks about the treacherous path. Compassion not handled right becomes emotionalism. Wisdom not handled right becomes this cynicism and a jerk. You know? Someone once said to me, generally speaking, there are two types of people who don't care what others think about them. Saints and jerks. What is the likelihood of us being one or the other? So be careful when we say, don't care about what other people think. Very true, very wise. Thank you for that advice. Yeah? Only saints and jerks. What are the chances that you are a saint, you know?
They say that about the aged as well.
Oh, right. That at least you have earned it, right?
That's right.
I've earned my right to not
Care.
not care. And there is a different kind of not caring, I would say. So I always share with people my grandmother's advice for her sister, given when they were in their 80s. One of her sisters have a harder time dealing with getting older, and then of course being dependent on the younger. My grandmother was always very good at handling her own emotions. She had a very stable, very devout Buddhist. She knows, I would say, about 5% of what everybody here knows about Buddhism. But she was very devout. She did her prayers several hours a day. She can't tell you what emptiness is, not what non-duality is, the 3 types of compassion, nothing. But anyway, I remember her telling her sister, her younger sister by a few years, she said in one of those times when the sister came to visit, and again, I'm so upset, there's my kid, and my grandkids, and she would say, we have earned the right now to pretend to be blind when we're not blind.
That's a good one.
And to pretend to be mute when we're not mute. And to pretend to be deaf when we're not deaf. That's the kind of not caring. So she goes, then you'll be a lot happier. Let them go take care of all of these things. Even if you're not blind, just pretend you're blind. If something goes wrong, let them go handle it. Because they should know that. He said, of course, if you want to, if you're going to object to how you think they should tell the grandkids or not tell the grandkids or manage this or manage that, it's like, no, now you've earned the right. You have done enough. Just.
Yeah, but the ones I know that still care are
Yeah, happy. She's at ease with everything. All the drama that's going on. We're talking about the drama, family drama. It's just like, she had 13 siblings from 2 sets of mothers, and feuding on so many levels because they come from a wealthy family. Grudges and all of that. I would say that she was the only one that when it's her birthday or New Year, all sides of feuding, they all come. Because she's like, equanimous with all of them. Yeah. Then of course, meanwhile, so when there's a gathering like that, right? Then it's sort of left to, earlier she would manage it, but then later it's left to my parents to figure out where to seat people, right?
Oh.
Because this person cannot sit with that person, and that person would not want to see that person, and should we this time invite this or not invite that? And my grandmother is always like, oh, invite all of them. But how to say this, at one point I remember when I was younger, she would manage that. She'd say, okay, these sit here, here, and over here, and over here. But then at a certain point, it's just like, okay, you'll decide. You'll decide. So she cared more about just it's kind of like the heart level. And then have goodwill for everyone. You have goodwill for everyone. It won't stop them from feuding if they want to continue to feud. It won't. But at the very least, you are not part of the feud. You can temporarily kind of be the one that everyone can agree to get together and temporarily drop their feuding and be. So if we can do that, sometimes we think, oh, I need to play a role to solve the feeling. Good, we give it a try. But we also need to know, okay, the karma is too complex, too complicated. So I will just generate metta for everyone. Again, Grandma didn't have the word metta. But I know this goodwill is a constant. So we know a lot, going back to that theme. Then, the buckets in the chain are like the links of the dependent arising. So this is just, no need to go into that, but that is saying that, one leads to the next, leads to the next, and leads to the next. Just that's how the buckets work. So then he equates them with the 12 links of arising, codependent arising. Then 6, finally, the 3 kinds of suffering are like the waves that day in and day out ripple the water in the well, endlessly lapping against each other. So all the forms of suffering. So it's like, when the water wheel is working, it's quite tumultuous. So, we're like that. So we are all like these beings wandering and turning in the water wheel. So he says, to this kind of compassion that is directed at being stuck with this kind of confusion. That's the basic, the beginning of this karuna. Prior to that could be compassion, the way we define it. Yeah. So maybe we need to start there, to suffer with. Because in suffering with, we understand how painful that is. But don't get stuck there. So from ordinary compassion, we need to have vision. We need to have understanding. And now we understand, actually, where the suffering comes from, it comes from I and mine. Then that is the beginning of karuna. Then there are 2 more kinds of karuna, which we will look at after our lunch break. So now it's about 7 after 1, again Central Time. If you're out there, wherever you are, we are at the Central Time Zone. So we will be back around 3 Central Time Zone. So if you're on the East Coast, that would be 4 p.m. for you. If you are in the Mountain Zone, that will be 2. If you're on the West Coast, that would be 1-ish. It's all ish, okay? So 3-ish, we will be back here and we'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Rain.